It was a quiet Monday morning when Miles Everett, age 11, stepped into the first-class lounge at JFK International Airport. Dressed in a clean olive hoodie and a pair of gray joggers, he didn't look like the son of a billionaire. And that was the point. His father, David Everett, was the founder and CEO of Everett Technologies, a global aerospace and defense company. But despite being one of the most powerful men in the country, David had always taught his son that money didn't buy respect. Character did. Miles held a paperback book in his hand, Stars and the Spaces Between, his favorite read on long flights. He had flown first class many times before, but this was the first time without his dad by his side. David had a last-minute meeting with NATO officials in D.C. and sent Miles ahead to San Francisco to meet his aunt. He texted just before boarding, "Board without me, kiddo. I'll catch the next one. You've got this. Proud of you. Love, Dad." Miles took a deep breath, nodded to the gate agent, and walked aboard. His ticket read Seat 2A. As he slid into the wide leather seat by the window, he carefully stored his bag, buckled up, and opened his book. That's when Alexis Grant boarded. She was in her mid-40s, blonde hair styled perfectly, sharp navy heels clicking against the cabin floor, and a diamond pin that shimmered like her ego. As the executive brand officer of Nilia Luxe, a global luxury fashion house, she was used to commanding rooms, not sharing them with children, especially not black children. The moment she saw Miles, her eyes narrowed. "Oh, no," she muttered, pausing in the aisle. "This must be some mistake." A nearby flight attendant smiled. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Alexis pointed toward Miles without even glancing at the attendant. "Yes, are we really putting kids in first class now?" The attendant, maintaining her composure, replied, "That young man has a valid ticket, ma'am. Seat 2A is his." Alexis scoffed and shoved her leather tote into the overhead compartment. With a huff, she dropped into Seat 2B beside Miles, brushing the shared armrest aggressively with her elbow as if claiming territory. Miles shifted slightly toward the window. He didn't say a word. He was used to this kind of tension, not from strangers, but from the world. For the first 20 minutes of the flight, Alexis ignored him completely, but every few seconds she'd glance his way and click her tongue. The tension grew, like a pressure cooker waiting to hiss. Then the turbulence hit. The plane rocked gently, just enough to send Miles' orange juice sliding off the tray. It splashed, a few drops, onto the pristine ivory sleeve of Alexis's $3,000 coat. The gasp she let out was sharper than the jolt of the plane. "Do you even understand how much this costs?" she snapped, holding up her sleeve like it had been soaked in acid. Miles' eyes widened. He immediately grabbed his napkin. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, offering it with shaking hands. But that wasn't enough. Alexis leaned in close, venom dripping from her voice. "Your kind never learns manners. This is exactly why you don't belong here." A few passengers looked up. One pulled out their phone, uncertain. Another whispered, "Is she serious?" Miles blinked, stunned. He didn't understand what he had done wrong. He had apologized. He had tried to help. That's when Alexis raised her hand and slapped him across the cheek. The sound echoed through the cabin like a whip crack. Miles froze, his hand flying to his face. Tears welled, but didn't fall. The pain wasn't just physical. It was the shock, the shame, the injustice. That's when the silence in the cabin broke. A man in the back of the first class stood up. He wore a black suit, perfectly cut, his silver-streaked beard trimmed with care. Every step he took down the aisle felt like thunder muffled by elegance. Miles looked up, eyes wide. "Dad?" The man didn't blink. "You all right, Miles?" he asked. his voice calm but edged with something deeper, something dangerous. David Everett had arrived. David Everett stood motionless at row 2, his gaze locked on Alexis Grant like a storm about to break. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The tension that had been quietly coiling through the cabin now snapped taut, every passenger on alert. Miles turned slowly, still holding the crumpled napkin to his face. "I'm okay, Dad," he whispered, voice small but steady. Gasps rippled through the rows. The realization struck like a match in dry grass. This wasn't just any child. This was the son of David Everett, the billionaire behind some of the most advanced aerospace technology in the world. The man whose name was synonymous with power, innovation, and discretion. Alexis's face paled. Her posture stiffened like glass exposed to sudden heat. David turned to her, his voice still calm but sharpened by fury. "You struck my son." Alexis opened her mouth to speak, but only managed a brittle, "He spilled juice on me. And you assaulted a child." David's tone didn't rise. If anything, it dropped lower, more dangerous. Passengers who had been pretending to look away were now fully watching. Several phones were raised, recording. The flight attendant stood frozen, unsure of whether to intervene. The lead attendant, a man named Marcus, rushed forward, eyes wide with concern. "Mr. Everett, sir, we're incredibly sorry. We've contacted the captain. Security will be waiting when we land. Would you like to move seats?" David's eyes didn't leave Alexis. "Number?" "She does." Alexis let out a shaky breath, searching for some vestige of control. "This is being blown way out of proportion. I was under stress. You were exactly who you are," David cut in, unflinching. "Entitled, reckless, and now accountable." Alexis stood up abruptly, her movements jerky. She reached for her bag in the overhead bin but fumbled. No one offered to help, no one dared. As she shuffled down the aisle, escorted by Marcus, whispers followed her like shadows. She hit a kid. Didn't know who his dad was. She's finished. David kneeled beside Miles, eyes softening. "Let me see." Miles pulled the napkin away. A red handprint still lingered on his cheek, raw and rising. David's jaw clenched, but his hands were steady as he wiped it gently with a handkerchief pulled from his inner suit pocket. "I'm sorry," Miles said, barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to mess anything up." David paused, then leaned closer. "You didn't do anything wrong. Do you hear me?" Miles nodded, relief starting to flicker behind his eyes. David squeezed his shoulder. Then he stood and turned to the cabin. "My name is David Everett," he announced. "This is my son Miles. If anyone here recorded what happened, I'd like your help. We'll be pressing charges." Hands went up instantly. "I got it," said a man in a gray blazer. "Same here," said a young woman with headphones draped around her neck. "She slapped that kid. It was disgusting," added another. David nodded once, grateful. "Thank you. You're doing the right thing." The lead attendant returned, breathless. "She's been relocated to the back of the plane, sir. Ground security has been alerted. You and your son will be escorted off first when we land. The captain also asked me to give you this." He handed David a folded note. David opened it. "Please accept my personal apology," it read. "This never should have happened on my flight." David placed it in his jacket, then sat next to Miles, finally in his assigned seat. "You hungry?" he asked softly. Miles shook his head. "Not really, just tired." David wrapped an arm around his son, pulling him close. "Then sleep, I've got you." And for the first time since boarding, Miles closed his eyes. Meanwhile, in seat 34C, Alexis sat rigid, arms folded tightly across her chest. The faux sense of superiority that once clung to her like designer perfume had vanished, replaced by the burning sting of humiliation and fear. Her phone buzzed in her lap, once, then again, then nonstop. She checked the screen. 37 missed messages, 10 from her assistant, a call from HR, an email titled, "Urgent, Crisis Management Required." And then came the worst one, a news alert. Woman assaults black child in first class, didn't know he was a billionaire's son. Viral video sparks outrage. Alexis swallowed hard, her mouth dry. The video was out. The world knew. Back in first class, David pulled out his tablet. But instead of reviewing stock reports or contracts, he began typing a letter. A statement, one he hadn't planned on writing, but now couldn't ignore. What happened to my son at 30,000 feet? His fingers moved with precision, each sentence fueled by pain, justice, and resolve. This wasn't just about Miles. It was about every kid like him who'd ever been told, through words or slaps, that they didn't belong. He would speak, and the world would listen. By the time Flight 207 touched down in San Francisco, the world had already seen what happened at 30,000 feet. The video, 57 seconds long, was everywhere. On TikTok, it racked up 5 million views in under 2 hours. On Twitter, it trended under the hashtag number Justice for Miles. News outlets ran headlines that screamed, "Luxury exec slaps 11-year-old black boy. Didn't know he was a billionaire's son." David Everett didn't say a word as he and Miles were escorted off the plane by airport security. His arm remained around his son's shoulder. He walked with purpose, flanked by flight crew and a sea of onlookers holding up phones. Inside the private SUV the airline arranged, Miles slumped against the seat, quiet. David pulled out his phone. Notifications flooded in. Texts from CEOs, advocacy groups, journalists, even politicians. But it was one message that caught his eye. "We stand with Miles. If this can happen to your son, it can happen to anyone's." Arjun Patel, CEO of FlightNet. David exhaled, locked his screen, and turned toward his son. "You okay?" Miles nodded slightly. "Can we get pancakes?" David smiled. "Always." Across town, Alexis Grant sat in a hotel room she had checked into under a false name. Her laptop glowed dimly in front of her, showing a dozen open tabs. Each a different news article, a video clip, or a savage comment thread. She hadn't slept, she hadn't eaten, and her phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Her assistant had quit. Her PR manager had blocked her. Her employer, Nilia Lux, had issued a statement. "We are shocked and disturbed by the recent incident involving Ms. Alexis Grant. Effective immediately, she has been placed on indefinite leave pending a full investigation." Alexis closed her laptop, leaned back in the chair, and pressed her fingers to her temple. For the first time in her high-powered life, there was no spin, no charm, no reframe, just fallout. That afternoon, David Everett stood behind a podium at Everett Technologies' global headquarters in downtown San Francisco. Wearing a simple charcoal suit, no script, no PR team beside him, just resolve. Journalists filled the room. Cameras clicked, live streams rolled. His video from the plane had already reshaped the national conversation. Now came the next step. "Yesterday," he began, "my son Miles was slapped on a plane. Not because he misbehaved, not because he was dangerous, but because someone decided, based on the color of his skin, that he didn't belong." He let that sit for a beat. She didn't know who he was, but that's not the point. He shouldn't have to be my son to be safe. To be respected, he shouldn't need a billion-dollar name to matter. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Acknowledgement, shame, agreement. Today, I'm announcing the launch of the Miles Initiative, a national campaign to address systemic discrimination in public and commercial spaces. We will fund education, training, and legal support for families dealing with bias-related incidents. This isn't about revenge. This is about reform. The room erupted in applause. Not polite, but real, the kind that lingers in the chest. David nodded once, then stepped off the stage. Back at Nelia Luck's headquarters, the board was already in damage control mode. An emergency shareholder meeting had been called. Legal teams scrambled to assess exposure, and the CEO of the company, Sienna Liu, paced her glass-walled office on the 43rd floor. She had just hung up with David Everett. His message was clear. Everett Technologies will sever all partnerships with Nelia Lux unless a public apology is issued and internal reforms are enacted. If not, we'll take the matter to court and the market. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was the finance division. We just lost 3 major clients, all citing the Everett video. By 6 p.m., Alexis's employment had been formally terminated. No severance, no statement, just a cold email and a locked corporate account. That evening, at a quiet diner in the Mission District, David sat across from Miles. A stack of pancakes sat between them, untouched. Everyone's probably seen the video by now, Miles mumbled. David nodded. Yeah, but you stood your ground, and I'm proud of you. Miles poked his fork into a blueberry. She said people like me don't belong there. David leaned forward, voice firm but gentle. She was wrong, and now the whole world knows it. There was silence between them, the kind that comes from something deeply shared. Are you going to sue her? Miles asked after a pause. David didn't answer right away. The legal team's working on it, but we're building something bigger. You started something, Miles, and I'm going to help make sure no other kid ever feels like you did on that flight. A small smile tugged at the corner of Miles' mouth. Can I name the scholarship? David laughed softly. Absolutely. Across the city, Alexis sat alone in her apartment. The silence around her was deafening. No interviews, no emails, no phone calls except from lawyers she could no longer afford. She opened her phone, scrolled to Instagram. A new clip of the press conference was trending. David's voice echoed from her screen. He shouldn't need to be my son to be respected. The comments were brutal. This is what happens when privilege meets consequences. She hit the wrong kid. We're not letting this fade. And then, one comment, short, cold, unforgettable. You hit a child, and his father decided to hit back, with justice. Alexis stared at the screen. For the first time, her eyes welled with something that felt like shame, or maybe just the sting of being seen for who she truly was. 3 days after the incident, Miles Everett's name was everywhere, from breakfast shows to op-eds in the New York Times. But it wasn't just the slap or the viral video that held public attention. It was what happened next. On a bright Thursday morning in Washington, D.C., David Everett stepped into the rotunda of the National Civil Rights Forum, flanked by advisors, attorneys, and a surprising ally, Detective Layla Jensen, a longtime advocate for youth protection and a close friend of David's late wife. As they waited behind the velvet curtain, Layla leaned over. You sure about this? David nodded. This isn't just about Miles anymore, it's about every child who ever felt like they didn't belong. The curtain lifted. Cameras clicked like a drum roll. David took the podium in a navy suit, no tie. His eyes were tired but focused, carrying the weight of a father who had witnessed both injustice and resilience. This isn't about a seat on a plane, he began. It's about the space children of color are allowed to occupy in this country, physically, emotionally, and legally. The silence was electric. My son Miles was assaulted, but what haunts me more than the slap is what came before it. When he apologized, when he curled into himself, thinking he was the one who did something wrong. His voice cracked, but only briefly. No child should carry that burden, not because of where they sit, not because of how they look. Then he dropped the headline. Today, we introduce the Miles Act, a federal legislative proposal to protect minors from hate-based abuse in public and commercial spaces. Gasps. A ripple of surprise swept across the room. The act will mandate bias training for staff in airlines, hotels, and transportation hubs. It will fund educational programs focused on empathy in schools, and it will establish a national reporting system for hate incidents involving minors. Layla stepped forward and added, "For years, we've seen cases swept under the rug, kids told to stay quiet, to forget it. But we remember, and this law will make sure the country does too." The room erupted in applause. A movement had begun. Back in New York, Miles watched the live press conference from the media room at his school. He was surrounded by classmates, some who'd never spoken to him before, others who once barely noticed him. Today, they leaned in. One kid whispered, "Yo, your dad's like Batman." Miles didn't smile for attention. He smiled because his dad had kept a promise. He had stood up, not just for him, but with him. By that weekend, the Miles Initiative had raised over $12 million in private donations, much of it from Fortune 500 companies seeking to align with justice. Even more surprisingly, bipartisan support for the Miles Act began forming on Capitol Hill. The House Minority Whip, a Republican from Ohio, released a statement. No child should face violence or bigotry, no matter their background. The Miles Act is a step toward a more decent, respectful America. It was a rare, hopeful moment. Something bigger than party lines. Something human. Meanwhile, Alexis Grant's fall was complete. She sat in the corner booth of a quiet diner with her new attorney, her fourth one since the incident. Her eyes were hollow. Her posture was slouched in a worn hoodie instead of the power suit she once wore like armor. She spoke softly. "Is there any way we can get ahead of this?" The attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Sylvia Moore, shook her head. "There's too much footage, too many witnesses. Now, with this act gaining national traction, Alexis, this isn't a scandal, this is a legacy." Alexis covered her face with her hands. This was never supposed to happen. Sylvia didn't blink. It wasn't supposed to happen because you never thought there'd be consequences. No response, just silence. At the Everett Foundation's community center, dozens of kids crowded into a science workshop. Beakers, wires, tiny rockets, all donated through a new partnership with NASA. At the front of the room, Miles stood, helping a girl named Amani adjust her lab goggles. "You really want to go to space someday?" she asked. Miles grinned. "Definitely, especially now. I've got more reason than ever." The room was quiet for a second, then someone clapped, then more, until the entire group of kids was cheering. Not just for Miles, but for the possibility he represented. He wasn't just a kid who got slapped. He was a kid who stood up afterward and never sat back down. That night, in the garden behind their townhouse, David sat on a bench watching the skyline glow behind the leaves. Miles joined him, 2 mugs of hot cocoa in hand. They didn't talk for a while, just breathed. Then Miles asked quietly, "Do you think she's sorry?" David looked out at the stars. "Maybe, or maybe she's just sorry she got caught, but that's not our burden to carry, son." Miles nodded. David placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't owe forgiveness to someone who never asked for it. What you owe is to yourself, to grow without her hate living rent-free in your heart." Miles blinked, letting the words settle. For the first time since the flight, he felt weightless again. Not because it didn't matter, but because he finally understood he mattered more. The press had moved on to the next scandal. The headlines had cooled. But David Everett was just getting started. While others were counting likes and views, he was counting facts, testimonies, and legal grounds. Behind the polished glass walls of Everett Technologies' legal division, his team was assembling something far more potent than a tweet, a lawsuit, not just against Alexis Grant, but also against Nilia Lux for willful negligence, failure to discipline discriminatory behavior, and contributing to a culture of impunity. The legal team had spent weeks combing through public complaints, whistleblower emails, and prior HR records. What they found shocked even David. 3 prior complaints against Alexis for verbal abuse toward junior staff, 2 of them women of color. All had been quietly buried. That was about to change. Meanwhile, Alexis was a shell of her former self. Her designer condo in Tribeca had been sold, her luxury car repossessed, her social media accounts deactivated after weeks of death threats and brutal comments. The press no longer called. The brands that once courted her now refused to even acknowledge her name. She sat across from her remaining lawyer, Arthur Mendez, a graying man with sharp eyes and a weariness that came from representing people who thought they were untouchable. "They filed," he said, sliding a folder across the cafe table. Alexis didn't reach for it. "David Everett is suing you personally for assault, defamation, and emotional trauma inflicted on a minor." He waited. "He's also naming Nilia Lux, and the evidence is substantial." Alexis finally picked up the folder. Her fingers trembled. Inside was a copy of the complaint, along with screenshots of internal emails, one of which was her own. An internal reply to a staffer who raised concerns about diversity in the brand's campaigns. Alexis's reply, "We don't need quotas, we need luxury." Her heart dropped. "This is going to court, isn't it?" Arthur nodded. "And with public pressure this high, no judge in the country's going to take it lightly." Back in San Francisco, David met with industry leaders from the top 5 U.S. airlines, 3 global hotel chains, and the Department of Education. They gathered at the Everett Foundation's private forum, an invitation-only summit titled "Belonging Without Permission, Reimagining Access for Every Child." David didn't stand at a podium this time. He walked among them. "This isn't about politics, Uma," he said. "It's about the systems we've all quietly accepted. Systems where a black child is assumed to be in the wrong simply for sitting in the right seat." One airline CEO leaned forward. "What do you want from us?" David looked around the room. "Policy, reform, accountability, and most of all, zero tolerance." A representative from Horizon Hotels spoke up. "We've started retraining front desk staff nationwide since the incident." Another added, "Our airline is adding bias response teams to our flight crews." David nodded slowly. It was a start, but it wouldn't end there. He slid a folder across the table. "We've created a certification program in partnership with civil rights educators, trauma psychologists, and travel experts. It'll be free, but if your company fails to implement it, we'll make sure the public knows." Silence. Then, agreement. Every executive signed on. At home, Miles was adjusting too, but in a quieter, slower way. The attention was overwhelming at first. Kids who'd never spoken to him now wanted to sit at his lunch table. Teachers referred to him in passing with a mix of admiration and guilt. One morning, as he tied his sneakers before school, he asked, "Dad, Did I do the right thing? Or did I just cause trouble? David knelt down beside him. You didn't cause anything, you revealed it. There's a difference. Miles thought about that for a long time, then asked, So what happens to her now? David paused. She'll face consequences, but that's not your fight anymore. The trial date was set for 4 months later, but long before it began, the court of public opinion had ruled. One journalist wrote in the Washington Post, David Everett isn't just suing for justice. He's suing to rewrite what justice even means for families like his. The Everett Foundation announced the launch of a national hotline for families to report hate-based incidents involving minors. It was staffed 24/7. Within the first week, they received over 1,400 calls. One came from a mother in Texas whose son had been kicked out of a country club swimming pool for not matching the dress code. Another from a 13-year-old girl who was told by her teacher that her name sounded too ghetto to be on the honors list. Each story added weight to the movement. And each time, David thought of Miles, his voice, his resilience, and his eyes the moment after that slap. Eyes that no longer held confusion, only clarity. Across the country, Alexis Grant prepared for deposition. The court had already denied her request for a private hearing. The public would be allowed in, cameras might be too. She looked into the mirror before her meeting with legal counsel. No makeup, no practiced confidence, just a pale woman with bloodshot eyes staring at a reflection she didn't recognize. She remembered the click of her heels down that airplane aisle, the slap, the silence that followed, and the eyes of the man who watched everything. David Everett. She tried to imagine what she would say in court. She rehearsed apologies, excuses, denials. None of them felt real. For the first time in her career, she understood this wasn't a crisis to manage. It was a reckoning. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the benches. Civil rights advocates lined the walls. Security was tight, and a long line of spectators stretched outside onto the courthouse steps. The trial of Everett versus Grant had officially begun, and it wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a cultural moment. Inside, Miles Everett sat at the plaintiff's table next to his father, in a navy blazer and tie. He looked older than his 11 years, not because of how he was dressed, but because of what he had endured and how he had responded. Beside him, David Everett radiated quiet control. He had testified 2 days prior, delivering a powerful, calm, and unshakable account of the incident. Now, it was Miles's turn. The courtroom grew still as the bailiff called his name. He stood, walked to the witness stand, and was sworn in. Cameras were not allowed, but the entire nation seemed to hold its breath. The boy from the plane, the one who had been slapped, humiliated, and then transformed into a voice for justice, was about to speak. The attorney approached gently. "Miles, do you remember the flight that day?" He nodded. "Yes." "Can you tell the court what happened?" He paused. Then clearly, "She didn't like that I was sitting there, in first class. And when you spilled juice?" "I said I was sorry. I tried to clean it." His voice caught. Then she said, "People like me don't belong there," and she hit me. The room was still. "What did that feel like?" the lawyer asked, softer now. Miles swallowed. "Like I wasn't supposed to exist in her world." Gasps, murmurs. The judge tapped her gavel once for silence. At the defense table, Alexis Grant sat stone-faced. Her legal team had instructed her not to show emotion. But when Miles looked at her for the first time since the flight, her lips quivered. Not from remorse, from fear. During cross-examination, her attorney tried to undermine the impact. "Miles, do you know how stressful flying can be? Maybe it was just a misunderstanding." Miles didn't flinch. A misunderstanding isn't a slap. A misunderstanding doesn't call someone's skin a mistake. Even the jury shifted in their seats. His testimony lasted only 40 minutes, but when he stepped down, it felt like a generation had just spoken its truth. In the days that followed, the courtroom heard it all. Passengers testified. Flight attendants confirmed the aggression. Experts spoke on racial bias in public spaces. A child psychologist explained how deeply incidents like these damage a young mind's sense of belonging. Finally, the judge called for closing arguments. David's lead counsel stood before the jury. This isn't just about a slap. It's about power. It's about what happens when that power goes unchecked, when someone believes their status entitles them to hurt a child. Then he pointed to Miles. This young man did not ask to be a symbol. He just asked to sit in his seat. Today, you decide if this country still punishes children for simply existing in the wrong row. The jury took 6 hours to deliberate. When they returned, the air in the courtroom buzzed with energy. Miles reached for his father's hand. David gave it a gentle squeeze. The poor person stood. In the matter of Everett versus Grant, we find in favor of the plaintiff. A collective breath exhaled. We award damages in the amount of $2.7 million for assault and emotional trauma, and we recognize the broader systemic implications that informed this verdict. Gasps. Applause broke out before the judge could even strike her gavel. Outside the courthouse, microphones awaited. But David didn't take the podium this time. Miles did. He stood on a milk crate someone had brought. He faced the sea of cameras blinking in the sun. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to go see my hand. But what happened to me happens to a lot of kids. You just don't see it on camera. He took a breath. Now you do, and now we can change it. That same afternoon, the Miles Act passed its first vote in the House Committee on Education and Civil Rights. With strong bipartisan support, it was fast-tracked to the Senate floor. The vote was projected within 60 days. For the first time in history, legislation born out of a child's lived experience on a flight was shaping the future of federal protections for minors against hate-based abuse. Alexis Grant, meanwhile, left the courthouse under heavy escort. No interviews, no statements, no planned comeback. She moved to a one-bedroom rental on the edge of Brooklyn. Her LinkedIn page was removed. She had no job offers. The industry had quietly blacklisted her. But worse than all of it were the words that played in her mind, over and over again. You hit the wrong kid. Later that week, David and Miles stood at the unveiling of a new Everett Foundation billboard in Times Square. On it was a photo of Miles, smiling, confident, standing tall, above the words, "We belong, no exceptions." David looked down at his son. "You ready for what comes next?" Miles nodded. "Yeah, let's help more kids find their seat." David smiled. Let's build them new ones." 3 months after the verdict, the Miles Act passed through the U.S. Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support. The headlines came fast. Congress passes historic Miles Act to protect children from hate-based abuse. New federal protections for minorities in public spaces, inspired by A Boy in Seat 2A. David and Miles Everett rewrite the playbook on dignity and belonging. President Reynolds signed it into law in a public ceremony on the South Lawn of the White House. Miles stood beside his father in a sharp gray blazer, this time not just as a witness, but as the reason it all happened. "This is for every child who ever felt out of place in a world that should have made room for them," the president said. "Today, we say loud and clear, you belong." Across the country, ripple effects began almost immediately. Airlines updated their in-flight training manuals with bias intervention protocols. Hotel chains posted signs at check-in desks. We believe every guest belongs, no matter their age, color, or class. Schools adopted We Belong workshops, funded by the Everett Foundation, teaching empathy through storytelling and real-world simulations. In just 6 months, the We Belong campaign had touched over 2.4 million students and 45,000 employees across industries. At the Everett Foundation Community Center, Miles stood at the front of a summer workshop. He was no longer the shy kid flipping through astronomy books. Today, he was teaching kids how to build miniature satellites using kits donated by NASA. A younger boy named Javier asked, "Do you ever wish that flight didn't happen?" Miles paused, considering it. Sometimes it hurt, but it also helped me see something bigger. What's that? That we can't always choose what happens to us, but we can choose what happens next. Back at their home in New York, David stood in his garden at dusk, watching the city lights blink on. Miles joined him, holding 2 mugs of cocoa, just like they had that night months ago. "Guess what Ms. Taylor said today?" Miles grinned. "What?" "She wants to name the school library after the foundation. Said I should help design it." David raised a brow. "You going into architecture now?" "Maybe," Miles laughed. "Or maybe just building things that last." David reached out, ruffled his son's hair gently. "You already did." In a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn, Alexis Grant now worked part-time at a local nonprofit that helped women re-enter the workforce. She kept her head down. No more press, no more panels, no more brand launches. She never tried to clear her name publicly. She couldn't, but she did something no one expected. She mailed a handwritten letter to the Everett Foundation, addressed not to David, but to Miles. It read, "I can't undo what I did, but I see it now. I see what I became, and what you had the courage to stand against. I hope someday your work reaches someone like I once was, before the hate hardened me. I'm sorry, not just for what I did to you, but for every child who's ever been made to feel like you were. You changed me, even if it's too late." The letter wasn't published. David never showed it to the media, but he gave it to Miles, sealed. Miles read it once, then placed it in a drawer, and never opened it again. 1 year after the incident, a statue was unveiled at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. It depicted a child seated in a plain chair, book open in his lap. His eyes looked outward, calm, thoughtful, unafraid. The plaque read, "Miles Everett, a boy who taught a country to stand. Dignity belongs in every seat." That night, David and Miles watched the city skyline from their balcony. Below them, a billboard flashed in Times Square, an image of smiling kids from all backgrounds, hand in hand. Above them, the stars began to emerge. Miles looked up. "You think I'll ever make it to space?" David smiled. "You already did, buddy." "How?" "Because now, a kid like you doesn't have to reach for the stars while ducking someone's hand." They sat in silence. Not the kind that comes from pain, but the kind that comes from peace. Life lesson. When we stand up, we help the world rise with us. Life isn't always fair. Sometimes the worst things happen to the people who deserve the most respect. But what defines us isn't what happens to us. It's how we choose to respond. Miles Everett, an 11-year-old boy, didn't ask to be judged, humiliated, or struck on a plane. But when it happened, he didn't shrink. He didn't explode. He stood tall, with truth, courage, and quiet dignity. His father, David Everett, didn't just defend his son with money or status. He did it with principle, with a belief that every child, regardless of race, deserves to feel safe and respected. What started as a slap became a spark that ignited a movement. They turned pain into purpose, injustice into impact, and silence into systemic change. The message is clear. You don't have to be powerful to do what's right. But if you have power, use it to protect those who don't. Being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you speak up anyway. Silence allows injustice to survive. But one voice at the right moment can change everything. We don't always choose what happens to us, but we always get to choose what happens next. Miles didn't just reclaim his seat on that plane, he helped millions of kids realize they belong too. And that's the lesson for all of us. When you stand up for what's right, you're not just standing for yourself, you're clearing the path so others can walk freely too.